He encourages us in storytelling and story hearing and sharing our stories and sharing life together. So it's with great delight that I welcome you on behalf of the United Reformed Church, and we look forward to what you have to offer us. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is lovely to be with you all. I just had a magnificent baked spud, which was delightful. I am really pleased to be here and very moved to be back in a room with people, which is a great joy. And I know some of you from Greenbelt or coming to Corrymeela or other places that you mightn't want to be mentioned, and I'm very glad to see you. I hold the United Reformed Church in great esteem. So I've worked in conflict resolution for a long time, and in the fields of conflict theory and in conflict practice, one of the things that researchers are increasingly interested in is not only how to transform conflict, but what models of collaboration are. And the United Reformed Church is a 50-year model of collaboration, organizational collaboration, and that is no easy feat. It's a complicated feat with multiple cultures coming together and multiple approaches to the question of church governance, multiple approaches to the question of interpretation of Scripture, and multiple approaches to the question of history and parish and how that has been shaped in families, etc. And a 50-year model of collaboration that continues to expand and thrive and continues to survive through an exhausting pandemic with leadership like yourselves is really something to be aware of, the transformational power of it, because the field of conflict theory continues to look for models of collaboration that work, and yours is one of them. So I consider it my honor to be speaking to you today. The topic for our first talk is just before the Jubilee, so we're going to talk about the temptations as we do that. First of all, though, I want you to have a little think about a time when you made your confession. Now, some of you might be Catholic or former Catholics, or like me, a bad Catholic. But everybody makes confessions, whether they're in a religious tradition or not. Sometime when you told somebody something about yourself that you were worried about telling them. And I'm not going to ask you to share what it is, so you can relax. But I am going to ask you to reflect on that. I'm going to ask you to reflect on the experience, again, in private. And I want you to give your attention. Where in your body did you hold the anxiety before speaking? What was the fear about what might happen after you shared whatever it was you needed to share? Was there relief? How long did you wait before you shared something? Was it a week? Was it a decade? Was it longer? Some piece of your life, and confession isn't just about wrongdoing, although it can be. Confession is also about the truth, telling something true about yourself. This interests me to think about one of the aspects of being human is that there will be times in your life when you need to say something to somebody because you need to say it and you need to be heard. You may know there is no answer. And when the person says, I don't know what to say, you might think, actually, I'm not asking you to say anything. I'm asking a different kind of sacrament from you. I'm asking to be received and for something that we might call God to be created in the space between us. This, I think, is one of the dynamics of being human, that wherever we're from, there will be, or there has been, moments like this in the life of an adult person. I have something to tell you. Take a deep breath. Don't judge too quickly. Don't shout. Don't walk out. I have something to say. You don't have to say anything back. I think all of us, in and out of religion, have had moments when we have been the person saying that and have been the person hearing that. And they are moments of powerful encounter. And we're going to think a little bit about some of those today, and perhaps think about what comes before that, and how it is to think about the inner life as something that can give rise to a certain kind of jubilee that can help. But first, years ago, I heard a BBC Radio 4 comedy show, and the comedy show was set in the wilderness. Jesus was in the wilderness and the devil was there. And the devil said to Jesus, "Turn these stones to bread." And Jesus said, "No." And "Throw yourself from the temple." Jesus said, "No." "I'll give you everything you can see from the top of this mountain." Jesus said, "No." And then the devil said, "Do you want a fruit gum?" And Jesus said, "No." And the devil said, "It's a strawberry one." And Jesus resisted with great virtue. And then eventually, this was in the 80s, the devil said, "I've got a fresh jar of Maxwell House," which at that stage was a luxury, and it's unopened. "I'll give you a spoon, and you can thwack the little foil of it open with the spoon." And Jesus fell to that temptation. I thought it was very funny, but deliberately or not, I have looked up regularly to try to find. I mean, it was one of those comedy sketch shows. It was kind of a 2-minute piece in the middle of one of those shows. I've looked up regularly to see, is there any way I could get a recording of it? It was very funny. But we are going to think about the temptations. When I was 9, I begged my parents for a Bible for Christmas. I was that kind of a child. Practically Protestant with such an interest in the Bible. And they gave me a children's Bible with pictures. And the first thing I did was to look to see, was there a picture of the devil? And I can tell you that the devil is sky blue and has flaming red eyes and has a convenient giveaway tail. Easily recognizable on the bus. And this, I think, is part of the complication when it comes to taking these texts seriously, is because if you're just going to be confronted by Lucifer turning up in sky blue with flaming red eyes and a giveaway tail, well, then it's easy to go, "Oh, it's the devil. Check him out." Probably going to be a bad idea to take any advice. And it's nowhere near as convenient as that. Here's how Mark puts it, just in one simple verse, you'll know this. "He was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him." It's thought that because of the community of people who it might be considered that Mark has written to, that the reference to the wild beasts here might have been some kind of consolation to the community of Christians in Rome at the time who might have been facing the Colosseum. And so he was with the wild beasts might have been some literary piece of hospitality and generosity to people who might have been facing the wild beasts. That's a consideration. Maybe Jesus just liked the beasties. So here's a collect. Jesus of the animals, when you were at the end, even at the start, you found friends in unexpected places. Animals with warm hearts and fur, strange tastes and needs and habits. When we are at the end, meet us in the touch of beasts uninterested in grand designs, because in your own emptiness, you knew what you needed, and you found it in claw and fur and teeth and pointed ears. The temptation scenes that we see in the wilderness reveal a lot to us. Slightly annoyingly, my text document hasn't updated itself. I need to go get my computer where the other thing is on. All of these devices that don't speak to each other. Here we have it. My computer's going to swear in a while. I have it set to swear whenever I get an email. Which will tell you the state of my inbox. I did a master's at the Presbyterian College in Belfast, and I was known, this was awkward, as the Catholic. And then when other pieces of my life became known, I was known as the homosexual. And then awkwardly, because I would regularly forget to turn the volume down on my computer when I was studying in the library, I was known as the swearing Catholic homosexual. Anyway, here we are. Luke chapter 4, verse 1. There isn't a reference to a temptation in the Gospel of John, but it is consistent throughout Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Just in that one line that I read from Mark, and then in Luke and John, or in Luke and Matthew, it is in this version. And actually, the Luke and Matthew versions are very similar, except for one really interesting difference. I'll read Luke 4, if you want to follow along, 1 to 13. Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan and was led by the Spirit in the wilderness, where for 40 days he was tempted by the devil. He ate nothing at all during those days, and when they were over, he was famished, which I always found very funny. When they were over, he was hungry. I'd have been hungry after 40 minutes. So, anyway, the devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command this stone to become a loaf of bread." Jesus answered him, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone." Then the devil led him up and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. And the devil said to him, "To you I will give their glory and all this authority, for it has been given over to me, and I will give it to anyone I please. If you then will worship me, it will all be yours." Jesus answered him, "It is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him." Then the devil took him to Jerusalem and placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you to protect you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not dash your foot against a stone." Jesus answered him, "It is said, do not put the Lord your God to the test." When the devil had finished every test, he departed from him until an opportune time. That's the NRSV, I think. So Luke and Matthew have the same temptations, but in a different order, which is very interesting to think about the different order. Matthew's order is topographical. It goes from the ground up to the top of the temple, up to a mountain, which does, Matthew is so interested in coming down from the mountain and going up the mountain. You see this particular topographical theology outplaying itself in the way that Matthew puts it across. But Luke is thematic, and if you were to summarize Luke's anxiety throughout the Gospel of Luke is, what's going to happen when this prophet gets to Jerusalem? So Luke has the culminating temptation being at Jerusalem. Luke goes from on the ground, turn the stone to bread, to the top of the mountain, to Jerusalem, the top of the temple. And what are these temptations? Even before we look at the substance of the temptations, I want to look at the word if. If you are the Son of God. It's permissible to interpret it in another way, which is since. When you look at the Greek, eis. And I'd like to suggest that it's worthwhile considering that that might have been part of the substance of these temptations. That it's not, who are you? Because I think by this stage, Jesus had a kind of a disturbing confidence about who he was. What we see here is perhaps the question of what am I supposed to do with it? How am I supposed to live in this power? Who am I supposed to be? And how is it to outwork itself in me? What will be of the quality of integrity for me? What is permissible but not wise? These are the areas of interesting temptation. Go and murder a population, as we see outworking itself at the moment in Ukraine. It is clear to those who can see that you are giving in to evil. But what's happening here is the question about, what am I allowed to do? Well, anything. Still, amongst them? What should I do? And what should I do? And will that serve integrity for me? Will that serve vocation, the deepest voice? And I think this is the level at which we can take these questions when it comes to the temptation. In Irish, you can start off a phrase like this. Rather than saying if or even since, you can start it off just with the word and. There might be some Irish speakers in here. Agus hu mac dia, and you, the Son of God. And from that then to extrapolate from it. Jesus is facing something ahead of him. His character, about 30 years old. What do we think? If you met a 30-year-old who thought they were God, or if you met a 30-year-old who didn't think they were God, it might be slightly more unusual. But it's a strange and improbable thing, and it's a complicated thing. What would he have been like as a person? What would dinner conversation have been like? What would have brought him to a sense of, this is who I think I am? And I have a sense of greatness about me. Yeah, wait till you're 25. You know, people grew up much younger those days. You know, he had been an adult at 30 for a lot longer than adults at 30 today are, or 40. He was facing a complicated time of occupation, intense political times, which we'll talk about in a while. And I think it's clear at this stage, he is clear that about who he is. This isn't a temptation about who you are or who you're not. This is a temptation about what on earth am I supposed to do with this? And so how did this come into record? Because, as it's said regularly in the Synoptic Gospels, these were solitary experiences. So somehow he must have told people, maybe a little fragment, maybe some kind of telling. And what was that? What was it like for him to tell them that when he went in for a retreat into a place of wilderness or the desert, the word is the same in Greek, what was it like for him to say, I faced a part of me that I had to face? In the desert, I faced this. When I was alone, I asked myself these questions. And in this, I hear a quiet echo of intimacy and friendship that somehow with people who he trusted, and it went into the vocal, the oral record before then getting noted down into the texts. Somehow there must have been a time when he spoke about what he faced when he was by himself in the wilderness. It makes me glad to think that people for a very long time have been doing the kind of things that you were recalling at the start, which is saying to somebody, I have something to tell you about what tempts me. I have something to tell you about how I wonder how to be. And what are the temptations? For something to be an actual temptation, it has to be a temptation. I'm stating the very obvious. I have absolutely no interest in drugs. And if somebody came up to me, any of you good people from the URC, and said, do you want to snort a cocaine? I'd say, no thanks. It simply doesn't interest me. But I know, and this is because of a history in my family, that there has been a tendency to a terrible, destructive relationship with gambling. And so I'm frightened of gambling. I'm not actually frightened of drugs. I'm just uninterested. But gambling, I don't know if it's a temptation, if it's a latent addiction in me, or if it's just that I've seen it up close too much for me to go, actually, I'm frightened of that. That's a different order for me when it comes to that. We're all different when it comes to that. Different things will provide a different level of fear for different ones of us. And I suppose in order to think that these things were temptations, serious temptations, they had to be the order of something that was going to get underneath his skin. And so stones to bread. And so the top of the temple and worshipping. And I'm going in the Matthew's order now, the top of the mountain, looking out over the kingdoms. What of these were tempting to the character of Jesus. One of the complications, I think, that we have in Jesus is that the Christian record is so insistent on speaking about him in such pure perfection that the idea of temptation to him, temptation that we take seriously rather than just a game by a God puppet, can be hard to imagine if you've been brought up in a situation where Jesus was so perfect that nothing was a temptation. But clearly some things were, because he spoke about it to his friends. Bread from stone, all the kingdoms, bow down, throw yourself away. What were these temptations? Was it a temptation to a shortcut and power and allegiance? Was it a temptation to prominence or position or magic or artistry or pizzazz? What were these things for him? In a certain sense, these three temptations that you see being masticated by Luke and Matthew in different orders, they create a certain kind of blank canvas for us to think, what do I associate with bread from stone? All the kingdoms, bow down, throw yourself away. What do I project onto those? Sometimes I think that they are about separate yourself from people because of your capacity. So do a bit of magic. Or separate yourself from your own life because of your capacity. Or separate yourself from your deepest integrity because of your capacity. The one where he thinks about throwing himself down from the mountain is the one that I think about most often. It's often quoted that we are not so much afraid of our devastation as our possibility, and that our possibility can be overwhelming and it can be hard to cope with. And whatever we think of the character of Jesus, and whatever I think about him, and I think many things about him on any day, I think he was possessed of a most singular sense of capacity. And I find it deeply moving, disturbing, and still moving that in the face of that capacity, he told his friends that he faced something like, should I just throw it all away? What did that mean? End it? You're all ministers. You've all been at those terrible funerals that you never want to be at, where somebody cannot cope with the possibility of their possibility. It is a terrible thing. And for years, I've thought about this, about how wise the scriptures are to say this is not a modern feature. The possibility of possibility has been a frightening thing for a very long time. And that possibility too needs great protection and great nurture and great pastoral care. That's my projection into it. My best friend took his own life at the age of 24, and I have been spending a lot of time in the 22 years since then thinking about that boy who got A's without even thinking about it, and who had such a life ahead of him. So I project into that something that I need. And that too is a place where we discover something that we might call God in the relationship with the text, about how the text speaks back to us and creates something in the space between the written and the reader. What is the role of the Satan character here too is a question for me. It's in Greek you can think about the tempter. In Hebrew you think about Satan, the adversary. It is far too easy, like I mentioned already, to think about the Satan character here with whatever, fantastical bits of goats and horns and fiery eyes, easily recognizable on public transportation. There was a fantastic piece of art came out a number of years ago from Cy Smith. Some of you might know Cy Smith, an English artist. And through Proust, he released this series of black and white sketches called 40. And it was just 40 cartoon depictions of Jesus in the desert, one for, done throughout Lent. And they're beautiful. At the start, you see Jesus cartwheeling because he's bored in the desert. As time goes by, you see him more haggard, or you see him shocked with himself, really. and you see him begin to face something in himself. And toward the end, 37, 38, 39, the Satan character comes, the Satan function. Remember that in Hebrew, Hasatan is speaking about a role, not a character. And it was only with the Septuagint that Hasatan, the adversary, got translated into Satan. And so suddenly this devil character, far too pantomimic, really, for intellectual consideration. It's so easy when you can just blame everything on the devil. But that the original Hebrew, when in Hebrew we speak about Hasatan, speaks about a role. And I think Sy Smith managed it beautifully when the Satan character comes into this characterization. Jesus faces a slightly more translucent version of himself. You can see through him, insubstantial. And it's that Jesus is speaking to. Recognizable, frightening, just like me, makes good points. I have to really engage. What's he saying? Speaks back to you in your own language. Here we see the Jesus character engaging with Scripture. It's far too easy to think about some person with a goat tail or goat feet saying this, where you just know from the word go, I wouldn't trust you as far as I could spit. That's not a temptation. Temptation is when it looks like you, sounds like you, speaks your language, and speaks to you something where you go, actually, that interests me. That's a serious theology of temptation. And Sy Smith, I think, did the best piece of theology I've ever seen in those magnificent 40 pieces. I think you can get them on Proust's website. I wonder which version of himself Jesus was wondering about who to be. Will I take shortcuts? Will I throw it away? What will drive me? What interests me? What measure of success, what measure of adulation is going to work? Here's a little sonnet. It's addressed to Jesus. Because you too struggled, you went into the wild with nothing to shield you from the light. You learned to shade your eyes from the sun. You sweated in your sleep in the heat of the day. You made up stories to waste time and to keep the fear away. It didn't work. You wrestled with a devil more subtle than the one you'd read about. He didn't lurk in the corner of a cave or scream at you with a night blue mouth. He didn't roast you or launch himself out at you all bat wings and hooves. He was always with you, but you didn't see that till the end. You'd been worrying about food and flight and fancy and how to be who you were. You'd been worrying about prayer and the way a man should care for his country when his country's a plaything for a despot. You'd been worrying about thirst and endings. You feared death, not fear, and both made you feel like a failure. What were these temptations that were actual temptations for him? What was the moment when he shared with his friends what went on in his life? What did they think of him? How did he fear their judgment would modify after he shared what he shared? In this, we hear the story of humanity. We hear the story of courage. We hear the story of confession that is part of the human condition, where all of us, to someone or some people close, will need to take the moment to speak something that is true for us, true about what might devastate us, or true about what might be brilliant about us. Both are just as difficult as the other to cope with. What's interesting is that this text of Jesus in the desert in Luke comes just before the proclamation of the Jubilee. Hence this little text title, just before the Jubilee. Let me read on from Luke's Gospel. Then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread throughout all the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everybody. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." He rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They said, "Is not this Joseph's son?" He said to them, "Doubtless you'll quote to me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you'll say, 'Do here also in your hometown the things we've heard you did in Capernaum.'" And he said, "Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over all the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them except to a widow at Zarephath in Sidon. There were also many lepers in Israel at the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian." When they heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of the town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed in the midst of them and went on his way. These two texts in conversation with each other are an extraordinary feat of literature. We see here something powerful and private and intimate, something that only passed into oral and aural memory through some kind of disclosure. And then we see here something political and public. And at the same time, you see that he goes to them and speaks something, and people are responding. All who hear are amazed at the gracious words. Who is he? This question, who are you, if you are the Son of God? And it seems like actually one of the things that bothered him and that he knew he needed to be cautious of was his capacity to be followed. That is so interesting. And in a time when we are ever more conscious about despotic tendencies to love to be followed, whether in the small parts of social media or through public life. It is a good thing to have a public figure in the character of Jesus of Nazareth who had anxiety about what being followed meant. And he seems deliberately to anger them because he sees that people are responding to him powerfully, and he pisses them off deliberately by speaking to them to go, "Oh, by the way, you are not God's favored. God has no interest in favored communities. God might send the prophet to the people on the outside of your border to annoy you and to let you know that you are not the ones who define the direction of God. Let's throw him off a cliff," they say. How interesting that that cliff and being thrown off it reflects so powerfully on throw yourself off the temple. And here he is able to do the thing that he has capacity for because he's going in the direction of his own integrity. That last line, I think, is amazing. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way. Somehow, in the temptations to him toward what it meant to be somebody who would be followed, and he must have had a psychological insight into that, somehow he needed to learn how to disappear in a crowd. That's what we hear here. This is not a magic trick. This is not Yoda. This isn't something that's done by cleverness or trickery. This is done by people who know what it means to learn to disappear. This is about the posture of the body. And this too is about an internal conversation about what is it that I'm called to, and how, and who, and what it means to pay attention to that. This is an understanding that Jubilee is not a personality contest. And this is an understanding that there's something bigger, even than him, at stake here. which is the question about how a community holds itself to a community, because Jubilee is always a community event. Jubilee is always something to which the entire community is called. And what we see here is the kind of leadership that says you must learn to disappear as well as be there. You must have the kind of relationship with your own wilderness that means check it out. Temptation's arrived. Not in the face of a devil, but in the face of a slightly more translucent shade of me. A part of me that looks just like me, sounds just like me, is as clever as me, but actually might just be about ego, which is always going to fade eventually, we hope. Certainly always needs to die. The temptations in the desert are to do something fantastical, turn stones to bread. Angels will catch you if you throw yourself off. Bow down, you'll be the king of it all. And what's interesting is that we're followed up by something that is fantastical. The capacity for somebody with deep and powerful traits of personality to attract people who wish to be attracted into a movement. To have within him the resources of ego to be able to say, no, not now. No, this isn't wise. This is not what's called for. We have a deeper thing to go to. Your anger will serve you if you can listen to it. Your aggression will serve you if you can listen to it. That's much more difficult than turning stones into bread. It's much more difficult than being caught in the middle of the air by some angels. I'd like to see a lot more of this kind of practice of miracle. People who have in public life the capacity to know that adulation is a betrayal sometimes of a community's dignity, and that this is the kind of leadership we need. Consider too, I think, as we think about these texts, that Jesus, at different times of his life, had to consider different responses to community aggression. I wish that at the time when he was being arrested in the name of empire in order to be executed, I wish that he had passed through the crowd. I'd have loved to have known what Jesus sounded like at 40, 45, 60, 70. How interesting. The midlife and the older life of Jesus. What interesting things he might have said, and what reflections he might have had on age. I'd be curious about that. But he didn't. He had within him the resources to think, just because I did it one way one time doesn't mean that that's always the way to do it. He had a capacity, I think, to pay attention to what was needed at the time. And his response to aggression differed at different times of his life and community hostility. Look too how this depicts at the broader political climate. What you see here is a community on the edge of itself, willing to kill one of its own, just because he said something vaguely theological. What brings a community to that stage? This is Luke's gospel, and Luke's gospel is often renowned for being a very pastoral gospel because it seems like, because of some of the kind of attention to detail and because of somebody referred to him as the good doctor, that perhaps Luke was some kind of medic. But in the midst of Luke's gospel being a pastoral gospel, it is, I think, the most political one too, in terms of how it depicts the political dynamics of the age. The way it goes through Herod and Trachonitis and Idumea, and going through who was governor here and governor there in those texts that you hear around Advent time. In the bit when Mary crosses the hill country in haste to get to her cousin Elizabeth's. That hill country was swarming with soldiers. Wouldn't you cross in haste if you were a girl? It wasn't that she was excited, it's that she was in occupied territory. I come from a place where there is a long history of soldiers present. And I know what it was like walking home from Belfast city centre up the Falls Road where I lived for years, looking at soldiers and thinking, right, I have a couple of pints in me, and I need to find out a way where this is not going to turn into something awkward. How to disappear on a Saturday night walking home from the pub. when there's soldiers around? How do we do that? And then similarly, even at the end of Luke's Gospel, the Emmaus story, we thought he was to be the one to free us. You see that over and over, and not because the disciples are fools, but because politics brings people to wish for all kinds of jubilee, which Jesus, I think, understood, but were not his vocation. Of course people want to be out from under the thumb of empire. My God, who wouldn't be? When you look at the torture device known as crucifixion and the almost diabolical levels of artistry that went into stretching life out to make the death as slow and painful as possible, who wouldn't want to be out from the place that used that? 300 Pharisees crucified along one road leading out of Jerusalem in the century before Christ. Their wives and children killed before them, just before they were crucified. That's empire. You know, there's nothing pretty about the cross. It's a symbol of devastation. We would be as appropriate to wear an electric chair around our neck and to say something like that than to think that it's a pretty thing. It's not. The symbol of the cross is a symbol of empire decimated rather than, oh, torture's good eventually because something good comes out of it. We preach Christ and Christ crucified is a categorical condemnation of Rome. And this, I think, shows us the level of tension that the community were in, that they were on the edge of themselves, ready to freak out when somebody amongst them begins to say stuff that they can't cope with. Are we all going to be killed now? I can understand the community of people who were like, here, shut up. Like, we're glad to be alive. Do you know what the soldiers did last month? Do you know what they did last year? Do you know what Rome did the year before that? Do you know the community you're part of? Do you know the relatives of yours who aren't alive anymore? Shut up. We'd sooner see you dead than all of us dead. And I understand that. I understand how a community can be traumatized by generation after generation of occupation. And as a result of that, have an anxiety about somebody who is able to cope with the possibility of sticking out. Lots of you are also from places of conflict, whether that's a community, whether that is a country, whether that is a family, where cultures of conflict mean that you have all kinds of ways of guarding your borders. And what we see here is that the Jesus character was fearless in being able to orchestrate people's anger to say, we need to be woken up to the possibility of knowing our own voice, of who we are and responding to that. I'm moving towards an end. Wilfred Bion is a group psychoanalyst, considered by many really to be the kind of founder of group psychoanalysis. I don't like him very much. I don't think I ever would have wanted to have met him. He wrote a book called Experiences in Groups, very short book, and I often have a Freudian slip and call it Experiments in Groups, because that's what I feel like he did with traumatized groups of soldiers. But one of the things that he does is to speak about what he calls the group dynamic. And that term has changed over the kind of 70 years since the publication of the book. These days, the group dynamic can be all kinds of things. For him, group dynamic was only about measuring hostility in groups. So it has fundamentally changed in terms of how that phrase is used. But he speaks about 3 manifestations of hostility in a group. The first of which is aggression, just outright aggression. And then the second of which is some kind of pairing, which can often be sexual. And by sexual, I don't necessarily mean seductive, but playing on the power of sex in the room and gender. So it might be that 2 men spar against each other and people go, oh, for God's sake, it's just a cockfight. He would say that that's a demonstration of the kind of pairing. Somebody will size up to you. So the first one is aggression. The second one is pairing. And Bion's third one is adulation, praise. As he says, that too is an abdication of the group's own power. And I think Jesus was very alert to, I'm not saying that Jesus was a pre-Bion kind of a character, but I think Jesus was very alert to the ways within which even praise was something to be wary of. Jesus always had something of interest to him. I wonder, was he a natural meditator? I kind of think, I like to think that he wasn't, and so therefore that's why he took himself away. Maybe it was the walk there and the walk back that meant. Maybe when he got there he was like, oh, I'm not sure what to do. But I like to think that it wasn't something that came absolutely natural to him, but that he knew he needed. It was a modulation of his own capacity. And it was him going, because of who I know myself to be, I know I need this. And I know this is good for me. I think that is, that's my complete projection into him. But I see him as somebody who had an innate group appeal. Clearly he was. People were interested in what he said, so much so that they recorded it and followed him along. And how interesting. And look at what his inner life did to hold him to that. All of you are in ministry, most of you, I'd guess, with a congregation where people are looking at you when you speak on a Sunday or whenever it is that your services happen, or look at you through a screen these days, or both. And you know what it's like to be in front of the complicated energy that comes from a congregation. Some who love you, some who love to loathe you, some who will be delighted to say that you're underworking or overworking. All of the kinds of things that happen within the context of that, and how exhausting it can be, how complicated it can be to bump into a congregant if you're out having a day off. What it is you say to prove to them that you deserve your day off. And that Wednesday afternoon is the only time all week you'll have. How quickly you might say that you didn't sleep very much because you were up early, etc. All these ways within which there's a strong, demanding, and sometimes exhausting kind of attention that comes. And Jesus of Nazareth knew he had a jubilee to proclaim, and within the context of that, knew that his relationship to crowd would need to be one that would be modified by an inner life that could cope with his own aggression, that could pay attention to his own temptation when it came to how it was that he was going to be who he was going to be, as well as know how to separate himself from whatever was going on with the crowd. He seems to have been as suspicious of praise as he was of the projection of aggression onto him. So interesting. How did he learn this? We don't know. The hidden life of Jesus. That'd be another thing I'd like to hear him talk about in his memoirs. What does all of this mean for us as we think of Jubilee? I think the most obvious thing is to think about the inner life and to listen to what actually tempts you. And not just for the sake of, oh my God, look, what a terrible person I am. But to go, let me think about that. What is the temptation towards? To listen to what's underneath of it, and to pay attention to it. To share, to find language, and to find a trustable community of one or two or three. I'm sure there's people here who are part of 12-step programs. I think 12-step programs are possibly one of the most authentic demonstrations about linguistic maturity that happen. People take words and put words after each other in order to say, this is what's happened today, or this week, or since the last time I came. I think they're quite extraordinary. And I think there is a way within which 12-step programs are speaking to the entire population to say, sure, this one thing or that thing mightn't be something that will devastate you, but we all need this kind of capacity to have a community to be able to speak to. Jesus too seemed to know what he was called to and have an internal discernment about this. And I think that's worthwhile, knowing what your vocation is. Vocation comes from voce, voice, to know what your voice is. I think too, to pay attention to how the politics of the day shapes aggression and hostility is worthwhile paying attention to, because Jubilee is always proclaimed during times of oppression. And to speak about Jubilee is to give an implicit recognition of the power of empire that's happening. And within the context of this, I think it's worthwhile having a trauma-informed understanding about group dynamics when it comes to this. to understand that what's happening might just not be because the community you're in are a bunch of this or a bunch of that, but to say, what's happening? How have they been whipped up into a frenzy? Who has been manipulating power in public? And what does my practice of leadership mean to have a different approach? That's a protection for yourself, but it's also a mark of empathy when it comes to the question about what it's like for all of us to be citizens in various communities that where leadership sometimes thrives on doing the equivalent of taking 5 wasps, putting them in a jar, shaking it and opening it and letting it go out and calling that the radio or the news or public debate. They are all failures because they are interested in the catastrophe of pantomime in terms of the exchange of ideas. They're not interested in education or change or reciprocal respect or serious engagement about what matters. They are interested in the spectacle of fight and threat and domination that will always fail us. And it is from that we need jubilee. And who is creating the circumstances within which communities are at the edge? How can that be the direction of our imagination of set free? I preach Christ crucified is a condemnation of the empire that crucified him. And to return to where we started is to return to the earth. Jesus with the animals. Maybe he went to the wilderness because he liked the beasts. For the last few years, I've been living in the countryside. And I have a family of hares, 4 generations of them now, out the back window. There's a tiny garden, and then there's just a fence and a farm. And so the hares are around all the time. There's the great-grandparents, the grandparents, the parents, and some new leverets born over the last few months. And I greet them with a level of wonder and recognition of a different kind of economy. There is a family of beautiful hares, or beautiful foxes also. Their pups went wandering around my back garden last year, and it was extraordinary. And then terrible when I heard one of the young leverets last year being eaten one Saturday night. It is the way of things. That wasn't empire, it was just hunger. And thank God there were 2 leverets that year. And there is something about paying attention to what is not paying attention to us unless we're threatening it. There is not just the ecological crisis that calls us to pay attention to the earth. There is, I think, the human vocation that calls us to pay attention to the fact that we are but one of the breathing things that breathe upon the earth. That we are but one of the growing things that grow upon the earth. And we are but one of the dying things that die upon the earth. And the question will be, how will we live in between those spaces? And how will we pay attention? I'll finish where we started with that collect. He was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him. Jesus of the animals, when you'd been led to the end, even at the start, you found friends in unexpected places, animals with warm hearts and fur, strange tastes and needs and habits. When we are at the end, meet us in the touch of beasts uninterested in grand designs, because in your own emptiness, you knew what you needed, and you found it in claw and fur and sharp teeth and pointed ears. Amen.